Welcome back to the channel, everyone. We're so thrilled to have you here tonight for another episode filled with spine-tingling, true horror stories. This time we're bringing you 3 terrifying accounts from the trails that are bound to make you think twice before heading out into the wilderness. These real-life stories come from hikers who experience strange, unexplainable, and downright disturbing events while trekking through some of the most remote, eerie parts of nature. From bizarre sightings and strange sounds to encounters with the unknown, these hikers found themselves face to face with something they couldn't explain. And trust me, by the end of these stories, you might not want to go hiking alone anytime soon. But before we jump into the fear, we want to take a moment to express our deepest gratitude for your incredible support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean the world to us, and it's your ongoing engagement that keeps this channel going. We are so thankful for each and every one of you who tunes in, shares your thoughts, and helps spread these chilling stories. It's because of you that we're able to continue bringing these unsettling tales to life. As always, we urge you to stay safe, especially when venturing out into the wild. Nature can be beautiful, but it's also unpredictable, and there's no telling what might be lurking just beyond the trees. Always trust your instincts and be aware of your surroundings. Now, without further delay, let's dive into these haunting tales from the trails. You may never look at nature the same way again. Stay tuned, stay alert, and enjoy the ride because things are about to get unsettling. Story 1: The Scary Encounter in Utah Forest. I had been walking for hours, the thick trees of the Wasatch National Forest towering above me like silent sentinels. Their limbs reached outward like a web, weaving a tapestry that concealed the vast emptiness of the forest beyond. The air was thin, sharp, cutting through the quiet with a crispness that made every breath feel deliberate. It was beautiful in the way that things that hide their true nature can be beautiful, deceptive, silent in their sinister grace. I had come to this forest for one reason, and one reason only: to escape. The fragile remains of a life that had come undone in the aftermath of a breakup had left me hollow, like a vessel with a cracked hull. The pressure, the aching absence was unbearable. I sought solitude, a break from the chaos of thought and memory that pressed in on me from all sides. I thought the forest would give me clarity, or at least silence. I was wrong. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more I felt it a presence, as if the trees themselves were conscious, observing, waiting. But I wasn't here to ponder metaphysical matters, so I shrugged off the sensation. There was something intoxicating about the isolation, something raw and pure in the way the forest seemed to remove me from the world. I was alone in the wilderness. Alone, except for that feeling that I couldn't quite shake. The trail wound upward, and I followed it. The silence deepened, as though the forest had swallowed all the sounds of the world. I heard only the rhythmic sound of my own footsteps, each step a reminder of my isolation, until the sounds themselves began to grow strange. The crunch of the dirt beneath my boots, the rustle of leaves, it was as though the earth had its own language now, one that only it could understand. The noise had changed, become almost sentient, like a whispering voice without words. I tried to ignore it, but the whispering gnawed at my mind, feeding on my anxiety. Was it the wind? I turned my head sharply, expecting to see something, someone. But there was only the silent expanse of the forest, the trees standing like mute witnesses to my growing unease. By the time I returned to the parking area, the sun was setting behind the mountain ridges, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt. The serenity of the place, which had seemed comforting hours earlier, now felt oppressive. My thoughts scattered and twisted, the paranoia beginning to crawl under my skin. It was then that I saw my car. The tires were all slashed, every single one. 4 deep gashes, each one jagged and deliberate. I could feel my breath catch in my chest. Who would do such a thing? My gaze moved to the empty lot, the silent forest stretching beyond, as though everything had simply decided to stop existing. The wind had ceased. Even the birds had stopped calling. There was a stillness in the air now, heavy and suffocating, as though the forest itself had taken a long, deep breath and was holding it in anticipation. I approached the car, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no evidence that anyone had been here except for the destruction of my tires. It didn't make sense. Why would someone do this in such an isolated place? The feeling of being watched grew stronger, suffocating me in its intensity. I glanced over my shoulder. The forest loomed still and dark, as though it had swallowed the world whole. My heartbeat quickened, each thud echoing in my ears, drowning out everything else. There was no cell service here. I needed to get to the summit at least there. The map promised a signal. But something in me hesitated, like a whisper in the back of my mind urging me to turn around, to leave. But there was no leaving now. My car was useless, and I couldn't afford to just stand there waiting. I needed to move. The trail that led to the summit was narrow and overgrown, the trees closing in on either side. The further I walked, the more it felt like the forest was encroaching on me, folding in on itself. There were no sounds, nothing but the soft crunch of dirt beneath my feet, and then there was something else. A rustling. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. But it grew. A slight shift in the air, a movement like a footstep. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was distant, yet so close, too close. I turned quickly, eyes scanning the surrounding trees. Nothing. The path ahead was empty. Only the forest, stretching endlessly. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the wind or my mind. But the rustling did not stop. It was there again, just behind me, a faint disturbance in the underbrush. The air felt thick with it. It wasn't right. The forest was too quiet. The wind held its breath. And then there a figure, just a glimpse. A flash of white in the corner of my eye, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the empty forest, feeling the pulse of panic thudding in my chest. Who was it? A hiker? Someone else lost in the woods like me? I continued walking, but the pace had quickened. My feet moved of their own accord now, the sense of being watched becoming more pronounced with every step. The rustling behind me, soft at first, began to grow louder, closer, more distinct. Footsteps. I knew it then. I was not alone. Not in the way I had thought. The forest was not empty. It was filled with something unseen, something that moved in the shadows. The sound grew, a slow, deliberate tread, matching my own pace. I glanced behind me again. A figure. Another flash of white, the same unsettling impression of movement at the edge of my vision. But when I turned fully to face it, nothing. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get to the summit, needed the signal. I needed to escape. But the path seemed endless, the trees closing in, their shadows stretching like dark fingers, tightening, pulling at my very being. And then, as if the very fabric of reality had ruptured, I saw them. Figures. More of them emerging from the underbrush. Pale, their clothing a disturbing shade of white, and their faces hidden beneath strange veils or masks, like faceless sentinels emerging from the darkness. They moved in unison, gliding like wraiths, their movements unnatural, impossible, as if they were part of the forest itself. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots, my legs giving way beneath me. The ground seemed to shift, to warp, the earth itself seeming to recoil as I fled. The footsteps behind me were closer, now closer, faster. I reached the parking area, at least I thought I had. It was no longer the place I had parked earlier. The lot had shifted too. It was larger, more desolate. The cruiser appeared out of nowhere, its headlights piercing the gloom. I collapsed against the hood, gasping for air, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I had seen, what had been chasing me, what I had heard. The officer listened with an eerie calm, his expression unreadable. When I was finished, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You're not the first," he said. "This place, it has a history, strange disappearances, cult activity. Some say the forest draws them in. They come to the trees, and the trees never let them leave." I stood there, trembling, the weight of his words sinking in like lead. You think they were I began, but couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't want to hear the answer. "Some say they're still out there," the officer said, his eyes darkening. "Still waiting, watching." The chill that had begun in my chest had spread throughout my body, cold as the very air itself. And I realized with a sickening certainty that the forest hadn't let me go. It never would. I left that place, but as the forest disappeared behind me, I felt its eyes upon me still. Story 2: The Echoes of Dudley Town. I cannot recall when I first learned of Dudley Town. It must have been years ago, perhaps in passing, perhaps in some half-remembered conversation over a glass of wine or through a hastily glanced newspaper article, the kind of thing you forget as soon as it's read. But something about the place, the name, the whispers surrounding it lingered. It was never just an old ghost story. Dudley Town had a weight to it, a malevolent history that seemed to be tied to the land itself, woven into the fabric of its very existence. The name haunted me in subtle ways, like the aftertaste of a bad dream that doesn't fade upon waking. The village of the damned, they called it, shrouded in myth, its very geography tied to some unspoken curse. For years, the thought of visiting seemed unnecessary, even foolish. Why go? It was a place that invited danger, not the kind of danger one could measure or predict, but the kind that slithered under the skin, turning the world itself into an enemy. Yet there I was. On an afternoon that seemed to bend the air with its strange pressure, I found myself driving through the twisting, overgrown roads toward Cornwall, Connecticut. The skies above were thick with an unnatural grayness, like the clouded surface of a forgotten lake. The trees, tall and gnarled, loomed over the road, their branches stretching toward one another in silent conspiracy. The town of Dudley itself, I was told, had long since vanished, consumed by time, swallowed whole by the forest that had reclaimed it. All that remained were the trees, and the memory of a place that no one spoke about aloud. As I entered the forest, the world seemed to shift. The trees here were not like those I had seen before, not like the familiar ones of the nearby town. These were twisted, gnarled, their trunks spiraling into grotesque shapes that suggested more than just a simple connection to the earth. They looked as though they had been forcibly twisted, bent by some unseen force until they could no longer stand in their original form. The branches reached for one another, not like branches of trees, but like the arms of beings trying to clasp hands, or the fingers of a great, unseen god trying to form a grip on the earth. I had heard rumors that the air in Dudley Town was strange, heavy with the burden of forgotten things, but I had not fully understood the truth of those words until I stood within the borders of that forest. The air was thick, almost viscous, a dense fog that clung to everything it touched. The stillness, too, was unsettling. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, no whisper of insects or creatures moving through the underbrush. The silence was absolute, and yet it felt as though the silence was not natural but imposed, a presence that pressed in upon me with every step. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the path narrowed, the trees crowding closer together as if to close off any escape. The forest did not seem vast, but claustrophobic, its boundaries uncomfortably close. The silence, which had once felt peaceful, now weighed upon me, pressing into my thoughts, into my chest, as though I could hear the forest breathing, if it still could. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to shift with every step, as though the forest itself were subtly altering, adjusting its shape around me, twisting to suit some unseen purpose. I stumbled upon something that had not been there before, a mark on the trees. Not just a scratch or a gouge as you might expect from animals or the natural wear of time, but a deliberate carving, deep and sharp, like an ancient rune or symbol. They were scattered across the trunks of the trees, here and there, as though some long-forgotten ritual had been enacted. But as I stood before them, I felt the oppressive weight of their presence. These symbols were not relics of some past era, they were alive. They were waiting. The very sight of them chilled me to the bone. Their sharp, jagged lines seemed to pulse with something unfathomable, and I could not tear my eyes from them. It felt as though they were drawing me in, their meaning not in what they said, but in what they refused to say. What ancient purpose had they served? What had they been made for? Each of the markings looked more like a scar upon the earth itself, a wound that could not heal. I tried to walk away, but my feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was clinging to them, urging me forward. The path seemed to twist and turn, each corner revealing new layers of the forest, its grotesque architecture. The air was growing colder now, and even the light, once a dull gray, seemed to bleed away, leaving the trees, the earth, the air itself to dissolve into shadow. It was then that I saw it. The small opening in the forest, nestled between two rocks, its edges sharp, unnatural. The space before me was not a natural entrance, it felt, rather like an incision made in the very fabric of the earth. I had not noticed it when I had passed before, and yet, now that it was before me, I could not look away. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for me to find it, as though the forest itself had opened a door into a place I was never meant to be. I approached the opening with a strange compulsion, my body moving against my will. It was like an irresistible force pulling me inward, a gravity stronger than anything I had ever known. As I crawled through the space, the world seemed to collapse around me. The darkness here was not like normal darkness. It was a suffocating presence, thick and palpable. It smelled faintly of earth and decay, but there was something wrong about the smell, something unnatural. The walls of the space were damp, coated in a thick, dark mold that seemed to pulse with life. The air here was thick, cloying, and as I stepped deeper, the weight of it pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I heard the faintest sound, a soft, scraping noise, like something moving in the shadows. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid, but I could see nothing. Only the pressing darkness. The sounds, though, grew louder, closer whispers in a language I could not understand, voices that seemed to echo not in the air but directly in my mind. I could feel their presence, pressing against me from all sides, wrapping around me like invisible tendrils, suffocating my very thoughts. The silence of the forest was gone now. The quiet was no longer the absence of sound, but a profound, unnatural stillness. A coldness crept over my skin, and I felt my body tremble, though I could not tell whether from fear or the chill that had settled over me. I stumbled backward, scrambling to leave this place, but it was as though the very walls of the earth had closed in on me. My steps were heavy, as though I were moving through mud. Each movement took an enormous effort, and yet the weight upon me grew heavier still, pulling me deeper into the cave-like space. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper of footsteps behind me. Something was following me. I turned, but nothing was there, only the deep, pressing darkness. I ran. But the deeper I went, the further I felt from escape. The path twisted and spiraled, the trees closing in, the ground rising to meet me, shifting beneath my feet. The light was gone. There was no sky, no sun. Only the press of the earth against my skin, suffocating, closing, pulling. And then, when I thought I could go no further, I broke through the trees, stumbling out into the open. The air was different, familiar perhaps, but wrong. Too still. The sky was not the same. It was darker, deeper. The shadows were longer, too long for this time of day. I turned back. The forest was empty. But something was there, watching. In the distance, I could see the figure, tall, angular, its form shifting like smoke, a dark silhouette against the dying light. It was watching me, waiting. And when I blinked, it was gone. Perhaps it had never been there at all. Story 3: The Mysterious Presence of the Woods. I cannot recall when it first began, this sense of otherness that slowly bled into the air around me as I entered those woods. Was it a minute, an hour, or perhaps an eternity that I had wandered down that faint trail, so innocuous at first? But now, as I think back on it, the sense of unease had always been there, just beneath the surface of my mind, growing heavier with each step I took deeper into the heart of the forest. A nagging whisper that told me the woods were never quite what they seemed. At first, it seemed a simple enough idea: walk in nature, to clear my mind, to escape the everyday clamor that seemed to consume me. I had heard the stories, of course, of lost hikers, of strange disappearances, of the unsettling, quiet reputation these woods had earned over the years, but such things were always exaggerated, always mere superstition, weren't they? The ancient, crooked trees that loomed overhead, their bark as black as ink and etched with the memory of centuries, seemed so benign at first. The path was gentle, the air crisp with the scent of pine and wet earth. I breathed deeply, savoring the coolness of the place, thinking it would be good to take my mind off my worries, to lose myself in the wilderness for a few hours. But something was wrong. I cannot explain it, but there was a subtle shift, a feeling I couldn't quite place, as if the woods themselves were aware of my presence, aware of my intrusion. It began with the silence. Not the kind of quiet you might find in any remote place, but a thick silence, a silence that seemed to pulse around me, thick and tangible, like a physical presence pressing in on my chest. There were no birds, no animals rustling in the undergrowth, no wind in the trees. It wasn't simply quiet, it was as though the forest had stopped breathing, as if the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting. For what? I couldn't know. I glanced around uneasily, searching for something, anything that would explain this oppressive stillness. But the trees were still, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers into the pale sky. Hurrying. The path stretched on, winding through the undergrowth like a thread leading me somewhere deeper, somewhere unknown. It was then that I felt at the eyes. Not literally, of course, but the sensation of being watched, of being observed by something just beyond the range of my vision. The kind of feeling that settles into your bones, crawls up the back of your neck, and tells you that you are not alone. But when I turned to look, there was nothing, no figure, no movement in the shadows, only the quiet, only the silence that pressed against me. I continued, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort that clung to me like a second skin. It's just my imagination, I told myself. The woods were vast and old, filled with things unknown. The stories were just stories. Yet the longer I walked, the more I felt the sensation of being guided, of being pulled forward by an invisible force. The trail twisted and turned, winding deeper into the forest, leading me further and further away from the world I had known. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was no use. The path had changed. The woods had changed. And it then rolled in slowly, the fog like a living thing, curling around my ankles at first, then rising up in thick, damp tendrils that obscured my vision. It wasn't the kind of mist you might expect on a damp morning. This was something else, something darker, more malevolent. The fog clung to everything, soaking into my skin, into my lungs. I could feel it in the air, pressing down on me, seeping into my bones. My every breath was a struggle as the air grew heavy and thick. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence, my words lost in the thickening mist. The trees, once so distant and benign, now loomed closer, bending at unnatural angles. Their gnarled limbs reached toward me, not in some benign gesture of nature, but as if they were grasping, as if they knew I was here, and they were drawing me deeper into their embrace. I could hear them now, the whispers low at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but growing louder and more insistent. The voices were strange, indecipherable, murmuring something I couldn't understand. Something old, something ancient. And then I saw them. The figures. They were not human in the way I had always understood humanity. They were tall, impossibly thin, their limbs too long, their faces hidden beneath hoods of shadow. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes on broken strings. But they were real, they were there. I could see them flickering in and out of sight just beyond the mist, just out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to face them directly, they vanished, slipping back into the shadows, disappearing like smoke. But I could feel their gaze intense, cold, predatory. I tried to rationalize it. It was the fog, the isolation. The mind can play tricks when deprived of light, of sound, of context. But I could feel it, that growing pressure on my chest, that sense of something wrong, something lurking just beneath the surface of reality. The path before me seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself in impossible ways, drawing me deeper into the heart of the forest. I could not remember how far I had come or which direction I had been traveling in. The woods had changed, twisted, and now there was no escape. I could feel the fog closing in tighter around me until the air itself seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. My movements became sluggish, my legs heavy, as though the ground itself was turning against me. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in my ears. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had to find my way out. I had to. But the fog was not the only thing that was closing in. It was the woods, alive now with something far older than trees, far older than anything I'd ever known. The trees themselves groaned, their trunks twisting and contorting like some great beast stretching out after a long slumber. I could feel them, feel their eyes, those ancient, knowing eyes staring down at me, and I knew, without a doubt, that I had trespassed into something that was never meant for human eyes. And then, as I stumbled forward, my legs barely able to carry me, I saw it. The figure. Not a shadow this time, but something real, something solid. It stood in the clearing ahead, its form taller than the trees themselves, its body draped in a cloak of darkness. Its face was featureless, a smooth void that seemed to swallow the light around it, and as it turned its head toward me, I could feel the world shifting, twisting, as if the very fabric of reality were bending under its gaze. It reached out toward me with long, spindly arms, its fingers stretching impossibly far. The mist parted as it moved, and the whispers grew louder, louder than anything I had ever heard, until they drowned out everything else, the wind, my own thoughts, the beat of my heart. I could feel the forest closing in, the trees pressing closer, the earth beneath me softening and shifting as though the very ground were hungry for me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth moved, but it was as if the air itself had been stolen from me. The figure reached closer, its hand now only inches from mine, and as I stared into the abyss of its face, I understood. It was not a being that had existed before. It was something that had always been there, something ancient, something older than the trees, older than the earth itself. I turned to flee, but the ground beneath me gave way. The earth cracked open like a yawning chasm, and I fell, tumbling, spiraling downward into an abyss so deep I could no longer see the light of the sky above me. The whispers were now a cacophony, a deafening symphony of voices, each one older, more alien than the last, all clamoring in a language I could not comprehend. And then there was nothing. And with that, we've reached the end of today's spine-chilling journey through 3 true stories from the trails. We hope these eerie and unsettling tales have made you think twice the next time you venture out into the wilderness. The trails may seem peaceful at first, but as we've seen today, there are dark and unknown forces lurking in the shadows, waiting to make their presence known. Whether it's strange figures, inexplicable sounds, or the feeling of being watched, nature can be as terrifying as it is beautiful. Before we wrap up, we want to take a moment to express our deepest gratitude for your continued support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions truly help this channel grow, and we can't thank you enough for being a part of this incredible community. It's because of your enthusiasm and engagement that we can continue sharing these terrifying stories. Please remember to stay safe out there, always trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of the unknown. Take care of yourselves, and if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new video. We'll be back soon with more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until then, stay healthy, stay alert, and keep your eyes open because you never know what might be waiting for you on the next trail.